Good evening, Red Waters listeners. This is your host, Double Speak, and we have a very special guest with you today. There's a great event coming to the city. It is the Modern Knowledge Tour, 2014 tour, and we have one of its speakers here today. His name is Grant Cameron. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Grant.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate your interest in what we're doing.
Now, this is a really unique tour for people who are interested in the realm of UFOs, psychic phenomena, as we were speaking about earlier.
Yeah.
Some of the topics that are going to be discussed here, I just want to give everybody a little bit of details about the actual venue so that you go grab your pens and papers. This is going to be something that you're going to want to check out. I'm going to be there 100% for sure because it's going to be fascinating and educational. So that's what we're all about here on the show, is expanding your mind. And this certainly will do that. June 9th is when the evening seminars are taking place. It's at the Marlborough Hotel. That's 331 Smith Street, Winnipeg, Manitoba. 3 speakers. It begins at 5:30. It's in the Skyline Ballroom. I do want to give you the email or the address that you can look up, so that you can do a little bit of research on the people that are there, and so that you have access to the information. So it's a little bit a ways still. So just check out modernknowledge2014.com, and if you're Googling it, just add Winnipeg to it. If you type in Modern Knowledge Tour, you'll get an option where it'll have the cities. Pick Winnipeg or whatever city you're in and find out when it's taking place. Michael Tellinger is going to be there. He's speaking about gold mining empire of the Anunnaki, their advanced technology, and the rise of money. We've spoken about this topic before on the show. Richard Dolan as well, UFOs for Modern Thinkers, the complexities and pitfalls. And tonight we have Grant Cameron, and he is definitely very experienced in the realm of UFOlogy. He has a vast history of research in this realm, and we're very grateful that he's here to share with us some of his thoughts on the subject of UFOlogy, psychic phenomena. Grant, what in particular got you started? Could you give us a little background to what you do?
Okay. Basically what happened is I was here at the University of Manitoba, 1975. This is just as the Vietnam War ended. And what happened was there was a series of sightings started at a town called Carman, Manitoba, about 35 miles southwest of Winnipeg. It started in February. I told my friends, we used to drive around the city, nothing better to do. I said, let's go out and see what I was looking at. I had no interest in UFOs that I can remember. Don't think I'd ever thought about UFOs, extraterrestrial life, anything. I was very interested in psychic phenomena. I was interested in the psychic Edgar Cayce. And while I was at university, I was doing a course on death and dying, and I did a major paper on phenomena surrounding dying people in Winnipeg hospitals. And this is when near-death studies had started. This is the early 1970s. So I was interested in that kind of stuff. When the UFO thing came up, the only reason I wanted to go and look at it is because it was in the Winnipeg paper. It was all over the place. People were talking about it, and I said, well, let's go see what I was looking at. I just wanted to see. And so we didn't go in February. And then what happened, it's actually almost 39 years to the day. This happened, I think it was May the 11th, 1975. CKY TV here in Winnipeg and CBC were both out in Carman trying to get photographs of this thing because it was there all the time, and it was called Charlie Red Star.
My understanding is there was lots of witnesses too.
There was. I took a poll at the high school. I lectured at the high school there, and it was 62% of the kids in the high school said they'd seen it.
Wow.
And the national average for UFO sightings is about 11%.
Yeah.
And I took those polls around Manitoba. I lectured quite a few places in Manitoba at that time. And in a lot of places, if you got away from the sighting area, it was 11%. Mm-hmm. So this is a pretty standard number. Carman, it was like basically half the town, but nobody wanted to talk about it. They basically what would happen is I would find somebody who had a sighting, and I would go and say, I heard you saw something. And they'd say, how'd you know that? Mm-hmm. And then I'd say, well, so-and-so told me. And then they'd sit there and they'd say, well, okay. And they'd start telling you the story, and they would tell their story. And at the end of the story, they'd always do the same thing. They'd say, I was the only one that saw it, you know.
Yeah.
And this guy saw it, and this guy saw it. And they'd give you 3 or 4 or 5 names of people who had seen it. I'm not the only one that saw this thing. And at one point, I had 350 people on a list.
Wow.
So what had happened was, this is May 1975. And it's May the 11th. CKY is out there. And basically what happened is they had gone out there the night before. They had gone with a complete crew, cameramen, reporters, all this sort of stuff. And there was a guy who owned the local airport at Carmen. His name was Bob Deemer, who was sort of the tour guide. And he would take people and show them where this thing was being seen, where it would usually come, about what time, whatever. And the local paper there, the Dufferin Leader was involved, the editor there. He was a pilot. There was a bunch of pilots actually involved. And so they went and they saw this thing on the ground, but they weren't able to photograph it. So the CKY crew goes back and they go to the there and they say, well, we want to go out again tomorrow. And the associate news producer said, this is nonsense. Yeah. Nobody's going out there again. It's a total waste of time. Mm-hmm. You guys want to go out, you can go on your own. Yep. So they went out May the 11th, the second night, and nobody was being paid. So they went out the second night. They had a guy who was a film editor, worked in the film room, but had never shot a TV camera, big, huge TV camera. He was the guy with the camera, and they went out with this crew, and they got it on the ground the second night again. And what happened was they surrounded this thing. If you understand Manitoba, you'll have mile roads. Mm-hmm. Mile roads going north and south and east and west. And so you can actually tell where you are in the middle of the darkness by how many mile roads you've moved up, east, west, whatever. And they had seen this thing on the ground, and the cameraman was actually at what was called the CKY Tower, or the CBC Tower, which is no longer there, on the north side of Carmen. He was standing there, and these other two guys had gone. One had gone south down one of the mile roads. One had gone north down one of the mile roads, and the object was directly in front of them. So what they were doing is they were trying to surround this thing. And basically the crew that was on the north side, the car that was on the north side had about 3 people in it, had come around, and there it was, behind a bluff. And they described it as 50 feet high, sitting like a movie screen. It looked like just like one of these old drive-in movie screens, but it wasn't touching the ground, and it was blood red. And it was sitting behind this set of trees. The one guy who was the editor of the Carmen paper had started to look around because you're in the middle of darkness, it's pitch black. So he's looking around at the Haywood Tower and the Carmen Tower, and he's basically trying to get his references as to where he is in the countryside so they can come back the next morning and check for radioactivity and this sort of stuff.
Of course.
So he's looking around, and then he looks back, and the thing is gone, and they can't figure out what's going on. Meanwhile, the guy who's got the camera, who's shooting at the far end of the road, he's got the camera, and he's watching in the screen. He's watching this thing intensify and glow, and then it would go down, and it would intensify and glow. And he said, the next time it intensifies, the next time it goes up, I'm shooting. He shoots, and as he shoots that time, the thing jumps up into the air. And the calculations that were done, I actually got a copy of this film, and it's around. You can see this film. It was done by CKY. It goes in 3 frames. It's being shot 24 frames a second. It goes from the bottom of the frame to the top of the frame. And you got to remember, the camera is 8 miles away because we know exactly where this thing was on the ground. We know exactly where the camera was. Yeah. So they're exactly 8 miles away from this object. And this thing jumps from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen in 3 frames. So like three frames of 24th of a second. It jumps up in the air, and then he starts to pan. As this thing's flying, it starts flying into the northeast towards Winnipeg. So he pans, he moves the camera along, and he moves it along. And then he gets to a point at 12 o'clock, and he sees some stars, and he figures, I need a frame of reference because it's pitch black. So he stops the camera. Then what happens is when they bring it back, they're all excited. They've got it on film. The other guys don't realize until they come back to the CBC Tower that this guy's actually got this on film. So they take the film back. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever. They drop the film off in the drop box. They come back first thing in the morning, and they say to the film editor, they say, what's on the film? We want to see the film. And the guy said, well, there really wasn't much there. It was just 2 little 6-inch pieces of that turned out. And they said, what do you mean? Where's the rest of the film? And he said, well, we threw it out. And he said, you threw it out? So what they had done is they cut out 2 little 6-inch piece of film. And what had happened, whenever the camera was stationary, it picked up the object. So when the camera jumped, the camera was stationary, so it picked it up there. When he started to pan the camera, nothing showed up, or they threw that part of the film in the garbage. When it got to 12 o'clock and directly north, that's when he stopped the camera to get this frame of reference. So you have these 2 6-inch pieces. So basically what happens is now CKY, suddenly this thing goes viral. NBC picks it up. It's all over North America. Everybody's looking at this film. They were calling it the best nocturnal night film. They had numerous witnesses. They had about 7, 8 witnesses. And I interviewed all the witnesses who had this thing on the ground. And basically they were in a situation where they hadn't paid anybody to do this film. Yeah. And so they told the guy, NBC wanted to interview the cameraman, and so he's always been described as a cameraman. He never was a cameraman. He never shot a film. And so they gave him $50 and told him not to mention the fact that they hadn't been paid to do this. And so when he left CKY, he actually took the film with him.
Mm-hmm.
He said, I own the film. He took the film. And when I caught him, he was at CKND.
Okay.
And I got him then, and he said, well, I every time I give a copy of this film out, because I told him I was doing a manuscript on all these Carmen sightings.
Mm-hmm.
He said, every time I give out, it disappears. And then finally he phoned me up. He says, okay, I'm going to get your copy. So he gave me a third generation copy. He had the original, the 2 6-inch pieces. He had a second generation, and I got a third generation copy.
Yes.
Mine disappeared as well. I've
wow.
never been able to. But it was captured on a couple of documentaries, and we've got it on documentary. So we've got that much of the film. And it shows this object moving sort of in a sort of a wave pattern through the sky as it's moving along. Plus, what happens is when it jumps, it goes from the bottom of the frame to the top of the frame. And in the second frame, it lights up the entire horizon. 1/24 second frame where we call it a flash frame, where you can see the horizon and these 2 huge arcs of light on the horizon. So that's what happened when that film went viral. Then suddenly it was all over Winnipeg, this story. And that's when I said to my friends, come on, let's go see what everybody's looking at.
Yeah.
So we went out. I had no intention, and I always describe it as it's like you buy the lottery ticket.
Yeah.
You buy the lottery ticket, you know there's a chance you're going to win, but you know you're not going to win.
Yeah.
And that's the way it was. I figured, like, everybody else will see it. We go out there, and there won't be anything there.
But
so
you have to try.
You got to try. So we went out there, and we drove around for about an hour. We drive into town, out of the town. We were looking at different stuff that people were looking at. We'd look at, Venus setting and stuff. And I really didn't know anything about astronomy or anything. It's just like we're looking around and like, what's everybody looking at? Like, what is it? And Venus was setting, and it looked kind of weird, saying, well, if that's what they're looking at, yeah, but it's not very impressive, whatever.
Yeah.
So we drove around for about an hour, and my friend, whose name is Larry, he said, we'll drive back into Carmen one more time. We'd been there for an hour. We'll drive back into Carmen one more time. If we don't see anything, we're going home.
Mm-hmm.
I said, that's good with me. It's a total waste of time, man. We were coming back towards Winnipeg. We were about a mile and a half out of town. We moved back. We're heading west into Carmen from the Winnipeg Highway 3.
Mm-hmm.
The thing appeared from the left to the right. The minute it appeared, and I always tell people, when it comes to paranormal phenomena, when it comes to UFOs, here's how it works. If you have not seen it, you can either believe or disbelieve. That's all you can do.
Yeah.
If you see it, you know. And people can do whatever they want. They can say whatever they want. If you see it, you know what you saw. And that's a very famous expression in ufology. I know what I saw. Mm-hmm. It came from the left to the right. And when I say what comes this thing about we knew, it wasn't matter of belief. At that point, when the thing appeared from the left, coming from the south, we were heading east, or we're heading west, so it was coming into the north across in front of the car. We didn't say, as we had done for a whole hour, we didn't say, well, is that what it is? Is that what they're looking at? As soon as it appeared, everybody went, there it is. Everybody instinctively knew this is what they were talking about. It was the most bizarre thing you've ever seen. It was bouncing up and down like a leader on a fishing line. When you have a leader on a fishing line, it's moving up and down with the waves. It wasn't flying in a straight line. It was moving and bobbing up and down. It was blood red. It was pulsing, very slowly pulsing. There was no other color. It was coming. It was very, very low to the ground. It was just maybe a couple of 100 feet up. Hard to tell at night how far it was away. Guess maybe half a mile down the road. Came right in front of the car. And I can still remember as we were going along, it was so low that it was going, there was a set of, they would park all the school buses on the east side of town. So this thing was going in behind the school buses, and I was getting out of the car. The car was still moving. And I'm saying, stop the car. And I wanted to run across the parking lot to get to these school buses before this thing went behind the school buses so I could see it. Mm-hmm. And I ran to the school buses, and between the school buses, watched this thing slowly fly off into the northeast. 2 nights later, I went out, and the second night, I grabbed all my friends that I went to school with, university friends. I said, come on, you got to see this. This will change your life. It's the most amazing thing you've ever seen. I remember we went out there. We got there. I think it was maybe 11:30, about 12:30, all my friends said, yeah, Cameron, yeah, we're going home. This is a waste of time. I said, no, you got to stay. You got to see this thing. When you see this, you will not believe what you've seen. They said, no, we're going home. We're hungry. We're going back to Winnipeg for pizza. I remember that. All my friends took off. There was 28 people when this thing first started. And what had happened was, because it was so popular in Winnipeg, these sightings, everybody was out there. There was kids out there drinking beer, and on back roads. Nobody knew where they were or whatever. And we were on the middle of this back road in the middle of nowhere. And there was like 28 people. There was all these cars. Yeah. And everybody was doing the same thing. They were coming from the city or they were coming from the town. Everybody was just sitting around seeing if they could see this thing. And this is 12:30 in the morning. So my friends all take off. And then I've got a bunch of school kids who are doing science fair projects. They're about 13, 14 years old. And they're sitting in the field, and my friend Larry is with me again, and we're sitting on the road, and now we're down to 8 people. There's us, and there's one other car, and it's a Roadrunner Courier car, and I don't think Roadrunner Courier is around anymore, but they were there in the other car, and I can still remember there was 3 of them and 1 girl in the other car. And there was a flash on the western horizon. We were looking towards the west, and one of the kids in the field said, "Is that it?" And I didn't know. I said, "Well, might be." And then it flashed again, but it was in a completely different part of the sky. And it was like a flash cube. It was like someone taking a flash in the darkness, way off in the distance, flashing it. And it was jumping 8 inches of the field of vision. It was here, and it was over there, and it was just moving around. And the kids started yelling and screaming, and this thing was jumping around. But it didn't look like the first night. It was just, the first night it was this very distinctive red pulsing object. And this time it was this object off in the distance. It was jumping around in the sky. And later I would interview some of the kids of one of the families, the most controversial families, where nobody believed them because they had so many sightings. And their parents weren't there one time. And I went and interviewed these kids who were about 7, 5, and the one kid was 1 year old. He was still in a crib. And they would describe this as the bouncing ping pong ball. And as soon as they said, "We've seen the bouncing ping pong ball," I knew what they're talking. This is what we'd seen the second night, this thing bouncing around in the sky. Really weird. And so the kids are yelling and screaming, and they're coming up. And I can remember in the Roadrunner Courier car, the girl couldn't see it because it was moving around. It was jumping all over the place. And she's crying. She says, "Someone show it to me. I can't see it." She's crying. And the people are swearing, and they're yelling. And as this thing's coming, and it's jumping around. And I can still remember the guy had a camera. And this is when cameras first had motor drives on them, where you could advance the film quickly. You could just, and it would move it. This is 1975. And I can still remember he had the camera on top of the car. And all I could hear was a click, zzz, click, zzz, click, zzz, click. And he was unloading the camera as this thing was coming towards us. This girl's crying. Kids are yelling and screaming. They're running out of the field, whatever. And as it got closer, it turned into the object we'd seen the first night. It got closer. The flashes got closer and closer together. And then it was this distinctive red pulsing object. It was coming right at us the second night. And it came in fairly close, maybe half a mile. Hard to tell how far it was away. Very, very low to the ground. And I can remember had a sort of a green glow on the back side of it. It was like almost like a plasma, you take a light inside a bag, and so there's no distinctive edge to it, but this plasma, this very bright sort of plasmic object, and it had the green glow. And I remember it sort of came towards us, and then it sort of just hesitated, and then it just slowly started to move off into the northeast again. And all the people in the Roadrunner Courier car said, "We're going to chase it." And I remember they got in the car, and they jumped in the car, and the gravel was flying because it was moving so slow, which is one of the distinctive things about this object that was called Charlie Red Star, that you could actually catch up on it. You could actually gain on this thing. It was going so slow. So they went chasing this thing, and we stood there. And later I went and tried to recover the photographs, but I waited about 6 months. And by that time, the girl had left the company. They remembered this girl telling about this story, coming to work and stuff, but they couldn't remember where she'd gone or who she was or whatever like that. And so that's how it started for me. And I remember the second night when I saw it, I instinctively knew that this was something. It was probably extraterrestrial. It was some sort of very bizarre sort of thing. And I still remember looking at it up in the sky as it slowly flew away. And I'm thinking, what the heck's it doing? It just didn't seem to be doing anything. It was just flying along like it was burning gas. And they even had descriptions back there. They said it was like doing a beer run. It was coming from the north, from south, from the United States, and it was doing this beer run. And it would fly by every night, and it would fly along, and didn't seem to be doing anything, which is something that sort of led me to other aspects of trying to figure out what's actually going on. Yeah. So when I saw the object, what happened to me was I saw the object. I knew what I saw. I knew it was nothing of this world. My father's a pilot. My son's a pilot. I'm not stupid. Mm-hmm. So I did the manuscript, and I wrote the manuscript, and it has now actually been optioned for a movie. And it actually may now be published. But I did the manuscript, and I remember I sent it around, and some people read it, companies read it, but nobody picked up. And the local publisher, the big publisher in Winnipeg, said, "Mr. Cameron, you may believe in this kind of stuff. Count me among the unbelievers." That was my rejection letter. So when I got that letter, I said, this is a total waste of time. This is a waste of time to do sightings. I need to know what I saw. And it was at that point that I started the investigation to go and try to find out what is actually going on. What did I see? Somebody must know the answer to this. And I started to chase the Canadian government. From there, I went and I chased the former president of Penn State University, a guy who had been the chairman of the board of the Institute for Defense Analysis, was an assistant secretary of defense, who had 14 honorary doctorate degrees, head of this Ivy League engineering university in
Was this the gentleman that was later? It was later. I might be wrong about the information here.
Yeah.
But was this the gentleman who it was later revealed was potentially trying to hide information or trying to?
Well, what happened with him was he had like, and what it comes down to is this is all classified.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a security clearance. He had worked in the projects from 1947 on, when the real modern age started.
Mm-hmm.
He knew how the cover up had occurred. He knew why they covered it up. He knew what it was all about. And so when we first contacted him, we contacted him about a document which was floating around, which is called the MJ-12 document, which is a document that I thoroughly believe the U.S. government, Robert Gates, who is former CIA director, and Kissinger were a part of leaking this document.
Mm-hmm.
And what the document was, it just basically...
So just a quick question. What would be their motivation for leaking the document?
Basically, they want the story out. You run the thing by limited disclosure. So what you do is you can't have people in 1947. You can't have them back not knowing anything.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you release material that's half true, half false.
Yes.
And that especially works well if you suddenly have a legitimate sighting. For example, if you're a famous person, you have a legitimate sighting, and you say that you were interacted by the U.S. government or something like that, then what they do is they flood the information, a bunch of disinformation into the UFO community. So they don't care that I'm here on radio talking about this. They want me to talk about this.
Of course.
They just don't want me to have the two key items. They don't want me to have bodies, part of the craft, or legitimate documents. So what they'll do is they'll float phony documents in there, but they want you to know that there's a live alien in 1947. They want you to know that this thing's for real, that there are extraterrestrials. They want you to know MJ-12 existed, that there was an overall group that were in control of this. They want you to know all this kind of stuff, but they can't spill the milk, because once you spill the milk, you can't put it back in the glass. Mm-hmm. So they do it through this limited disclosure of phony stuff, real stuff, and they can basically have the story come out and get people to do it. And I believe the aliens are doing exactly the same thing. It's this limited disclosure thing. The aliens, in fact, in one very key moment in 1967, there was a police officer in Nebraska who was abducted. And in his regression, this was one of the only abductions back at that time. There was only Betty and Barney Hill in 61, then this guy in 67. Mm-hmm. And what he was told by the aliens, which I think is a critically important thing, is he said, "We want you to believe in us, but just a little bit." So what they're doing is if the aliens wanted you to know, or whoever is flying these crafts, if they wanted you to know exactly what's going on, they'd land on the White House lawn and tell you.
Absolutely.
They don't want you, but they want you to figure it out for yourself. Life is experience. They want you to come to the conclusion, because if they drive it down your throat and force you, then everything sort of falls apart. So
it's similar to eliminating one person's ability to evolve in their own time.
Exactly.
Whereas if they were to completely put themselves out there for everyone to see, then your consciousness is not going to have the opportunity to expand to that level of awareness where you come to
right.
see.
You've got it. Sure, that's how it works, and so when the time is right, then you learn it, and so this has been a gradual thing that both sides have played this game, and we basically have learned an awful lot about what's going on. I remember in 1975 when I started, there really was no idea about abductions, gray aliens, reptilians, crash flying saucers, dead alien bodies. None of that existed when I started. When I started, it was basically there's stuff flying around. They land on the ground every once in a while. The little aliens walk around. And what you see, and this is what I'll be talking about June the 9th, this is part of my lecture, is this alien disclosure thing, which I think is very important. That I've been in it so long that I can actually go back and I can look at the history of ufology and I can put it in perspective and say, you think you know what's going on, you don't know what's going on, because basically what happens is you see the aliens doing a pattern. For example, if you look at the abduction people, the people who do abduction material, Hopkins, Jacobs, some of the expert guys, they'll clearly say that abductions have gone on since 1900. But the first one that became public was 1961. And the idea that people sort of get this idea in their head, well, abductions, that's, people, the alien erases your memory, and then they don't do it quite right. And it starts to leak out, and suddenly you remember a little bit, and then you remember more or whatever. If that was the way it was working, then the people from 1900 to 1961 would be the people who would be remembering stuff. It was completely cleared. It was completely sealed up that nobody remembered anything till 1961, as if in 1961 the alien said, okay, it's time to turn this on. Turn on Betty and Barney Hill. Turn on this police officer in 67. We'll take Travis Walton, 1975. We'll take him for 5 days. We want this story out. We want people to get this story. So we'll take this guy and keep him for 5 days. This will make it for a big story. And so that's what they're doing. Yep. And if you take a look at back when I started, there was all these different things that people don't realize that don't happen anymore. There were stories in 1975, 1980, going up to about 1990, of little aliens. There was one in just outside Portage la Prairie, a guy I talked to with his girlfriend. Little guy walking around with a rod. This does not happen anymore. You never get cases of UFOs landing on the ground and little aliens running around picking up dirt, picking up soil samples, picking up plants. That happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that the extraterrestrial presence was more? They were willing to communicate and show themselves directly to people more during that time period than now.
See, that's what I say. I think it's part of a disclosure thing. It's part of acclimatizing you. So you have these things like from 1947 was when it first started. After we detonated the atomic bomb, which is a key part of this whole story.
Absolutely.
They detonate the atomic bomb. From 47 till 1952, there was nobody walking around saying, I'm talking to aliens. These aliens that came and they abducted me, they talked to me, they took me for a ride. It didn't happen. The first, what we call contactees in the 1950s, didn't appear till 2 weeks after the detonation of the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb was very important compared to the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was something you'd do a lot of mess with. The hydrogen bomb, and this was inside the U.S. government, because one of my expertise was the U.S. president. So I studied this whole thing.
Absolutely.
And I know that there was a meeting inside the White House in December of 1952, the month after they detonated the hydrogen bomb, that they wanted Truman to go in front of the American public, and they wanted him to tell the truth about the hydrogen bomb, that we should tell the people that for the first time in history, we have a hydrogen bomb. For the first time in history, we can now destroy the world. And so you have this situation where you see this pattern where nobody is talking, aliens aren't talking to anybody till 1952. As soon as the hydrogen bomb is detonated, 2 weeks later, you have Adamski and Williamson, two guys come out and they say, we're in the desert. These aliens contacted us. They said, you got to stop the atomic tests. You're interfering with the whole universe. This affects everybody else. And that's when it starts. So you have that. Then you have these aliens running around, sort of around crafts. The other thing that happens in the 60s, 70s, 80s, it doesn't happen anymore, is you'd have a lot of people would describe, Betty and Barney Hill was a prime example. When they first saw their craft, Barney's got the binoculars and he's looking, and the aliens are looking out the windows. They have windows. It does not happen anymore. You do not have any cases of somebody will tell you a story. Oh, I saw this UFO and there was windows and there was aliens. But if you go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's all over the place, these stories. So that's where you see that it's if it was a random type phenomena where aliens were just sort of doing it and it's just random and there's really no meaning to it, it would be consistent throughout history. It's not. You see these patterns. The other thing that happened during the Carmen flap when I was going, in Carmen, Roland, Manitoba, Altona, Morden, Manitoba, all these places we had these landings. We'd had landings and they have little tripod marks. The three little legs would come down. They'd have these tripod marks. Does not happen anymore. We had 4,000 cases. And if you hear Stanton Friedman talk about it, he will talk about the physical evidence. We've got 4,000 landing trace cases. But we haven't had one really for 10 years. It just basically stopped. And the guy who was the prime authority on it was Ted Phillips. I went to him 10 years ago already. He said, Ted, tell me if I'm wrong. I think it stopped. I don't think there's any landing traces. He says, I think you're right. It's basically stopped. So what you see, whatever's going on, there's a pattern. There's one thing happening, and it's almost like we're looking at a book. And the aliens or whoever is just turning the pages of a book, and then they're moving us to this step, to this step, to this step, and they're just moving you along this path where they're acclimatizing you, where you're bringing you, or what we say is raising consciousness. And the thing that I work most on now is consciousness. I had a direct inspiration in 2012 in Phoenix, Arizona, watching a lecture where I got this idea that consciousness is where it's all about. And so you have this whole thing where I work on now that the aliens are actually downloading people's consciousness and they're raising people's consciousness. And it's almost like what I say is in the UFO community, psychic phenomena community, we are no different than any other social and political movement. At some point, we're going to get to a stage where, like the gay rights movement, the civil rights movement, all these different movements, where suddenly you're going to get a sort of a critical mass, and it's suddenly going to go over the hill. And then you're going to get something like Rush Limbaugh say, give it to them. They got gay marriage. Give them gay marriage. And you see that twist. But you need to raise the consciousness, and that's what's happening is the aliens want you to talk about it. The government wants you to talk about it. They want you to raise the consciousness. It doesn't matter whether the stories are good. It doesn't matter whether they're telling the truth. It doesn't matter what Hollywood puts in movies. It's raising consciousness. The more you talk about it, the more you're going to get a situation where...
my question, sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say, I'm curious, though, about the concept of raising the consciousness. Now, it's then we should make the assumption that the establishment, and we'll just refer to it as the establishment, the powers that be, Canadian, American, global, whatever, would they share the same agenda that the extraterrestrials, the aliens, might have?
Yeah.
If they have a separate agenda, then there's the possibility that the introduction, the information that's pushed out to indoctrinate us into that belief system of aliens could be completely separate than what this alien race is trying to teach us.
Yeah.
Do you have any fear about that? I guess basically to summarize, I suppose I'm always concerned because I've seen a lot of documentaries and I've spoken to people about the idea that there's a secret conflict that's taking place between an existing world establishment order. For whatever term you want to use, and the alien race, and that there's almost an unknown, hidden space war taking place between us here on Earth and this alien race because of this inability or this distance, this lack of communication. Do you think that there's any? Well, I'll let you.
Okay, it's a kind of a complex,
of course,
number of questions. If you look at the material. I look at it differently. When I look at the government, and I chased around the CIA, I chased around the president. I actually had the head scientist of the CIA commented on my latest book. I mean,
awesome.
So I mean, they're reading the stuff, they're watching. I have a different impression. People have this what I call is we sort of drink CNN Kool-Aid all day long, and we have this fear impression of what's going on in the earth. I see it a little bit different. I say that and I wrote an article called The 64 Reasons They've Decided Not to Tell You the Truth.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
And basically what I say is that there really are no evil leaders. There are people up there, whether it's George Bush, whether it's Cheney, who I talked to, and I actually talked to him about UFOs.
Yeah.
Basically, I do not believe there are leaders who get up every morning and say,
evil.
Let's see if I want to destroy the world for my grandchildren. They all think, as deluded as they may be and as wrong in what they're doing, they actually think they're doing the right thing.
Exactly.
So you always have they always have to keep that in mind. So when I look at it, I say, when you're looking at the cover-up, you got to look at the government and you got to put yourself in their position.
Yeah.
And when you put yourself in your position, you suddenly see the other side of the story.
Yeah.
I mean, people say, we want free energy. I say, well, do you really want to give Al-Qaeda free energy?
Yeah.
Do you want to give it to China with like $2 an hour wage rates? Do you want to give it to India where they have super low wage rates and India and China have the infrastructure that we don't have? We've got this old infrastructure of telephone poles and stuff like that. They've built their infrastructure in the last 20 years. And so if you're the government, you're looking at these kind of things and that you start looking at it and you start looking at it like a government guy would look at it and you say, wow. Do we want to, you realize, and as I said, the energy that's involved in this kind of stuff is going to make nuclear weapons look like matchsticks. It's tremendously powerful technology. So basically what you say is we're the good guys. We're, Jesus and God are on our side and we're the light of the world and the Americans, whatever. So if we have the technology, it's up to us to keep it. The same as they have they're never going to release the technology for the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, for all the secret weapon type stuff they have, because they don't. Whatever you tell you and me, they're going to tell the enemy. So it works like a paranoid type government situation where the whole world's trying to overthrow us. We have this technology, and part of what it's all about is weapons. It's about if you control the technology. If you have to use it, it's called lead time stuff. So when the atomic bomb was used during World War II, there's nothing the Japanese could do. They had to surrender because it's going to take you 6 years to build an atomic bomb. You can't start to build an atomic bomb as they're using it on you. So it comes down to this lead weapon thing that wars today will be over in a day. So if you have a technology where you're 50 years ahead, it's game over. You control the world. And that's basically, I think, what it comes down to. It's this paranoid military. But if you take a look at a lot of the information that comes out of MILABs, there's a lot of people who do the MILAB research, where I've got friends that have told me stories, and I've sat them down and said, tell me the story from beginning to end, exactly what happened. They will tell these stories of being in situations where the aliens and the humans were in the same room, and that they were being taught to levitate. The government was teaching them to levitate objects off a table and through a hoop. So you have this indication that the government and the aliens are working together, and it's this consciousness raising. It's this trying to develop this ability of the mind, which is one of the key elements.
Return us, even some people would say, to that original state of consciousness that maybe we lost along the way. But,
it's very, very powerful stuff. And if you realize what I say is, when you take a look at this important part of consciousness, what I think actually happened, I'm almost 100% certain this happened. And this goes to one of the things I'm going to talk about in June the 9th, is I'm going to go through the best available evidence. And one of the best pieces of evidence that prove that this UFO thing is extraterrestrial and it's real and it's whatever is a Canadian government document. This is a document that was written 1950. It was written by the Department of Transport. What happened was in 1950, the Canadians, same as the Americans, were trying to figure out what was going on. And they had gone to the American embassy in Washington, D.C. with their military liaison, and they'd gone to the Americans and they said, what's the deal with flying saucers? What is this for real? And they went through classified channels. Now, this document was written, and it's in the Canadian government archives. They do not deny this document has existed. It was declassified to confidential in 1967. It was finally declassified in 1978. This document is there clearly. They say, we went to the Americans, we asked through the discreet inquiries made through the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. What we were told is, number one, flying saucers exist. Number two, it's the most highly classified subject in the United States, rated 2 points higher than the hydrogen bomb. Number three, there's a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush, who is a science advisor to President Roosevelt, who was in charge of the atomic bomb, the plastic explosives, the jet engine, the homing torpedo, all the inventions of World War II. This guy was in charge of all those developments. He was the scientist in charge, and said a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush is in charge of trying to figure out the modus operandi of these objects. And the fourth thing they said, the subject is considered to be of tremendous significance to the Americans. And then the next object, which I ignored for 35 years, which most people in ufology still ignore, the very next line in the document says, and we were also told by American officials, not people on the street, American officials, that other things might be associated with the flying saucers, such as mental phenomena. And the Americans aren't doing very well because they said if we have everybody working on this, they're willing to exchange credentials and talk to us. So the Americans are saying, we'll talk to you about this mental phenomena thing. So the question is, as I said, nobody said that they were talking to aliens till 1952. Nobody said they'd been abducted till 1961. So where did this thing about mental phenomena come from in 1950? Already the American officials were telling the Canadians that mental phenomena was part of the UFO phenomena. And the reason they knew it was because in 1947, there was a crash in Roswell, New Mexico, and they recovered a live alien. The two top guys that are working, and there's 600 witnesses, and none of these witnesses are talking about weather balloons. There's 600 first, second, and third-hand witnesses there, and there's 12 of them who talk about the live alien, that one of the aliens was alive. So what happens is, when they went to the crash site, and they were picking up the bodies, the craft, one of the aliens was alive, and it was talking telepathically in their head. The key is, all aliens, you look at it, all aliens are telepathic. They understand consciousness. So when they're picking up the craft, this alien is talking in their heads. So you're an American official, you get this word that there's an alien, that they've recovered an actual body, a live alien, and it's talking in their heads, and they suddenly go, wow, if we could do this, can you imagine the power? Can you imagine the devastation if the Russians got this or the Chinese got this? We have to control this technology. That's why in 1950, you see 1951, 6 months after this memo was written, there was a meeting that took place in Montreal at a hotel. And the McGill University, Dr. Ewan Cameron was there. All the CIA was there.
Of course.
There was a guy from the head guy for weapons in Canada was there, Dr. Oman Salant.
For listeners, sorry, I just wanted to mention for listeners, Cameron, we've spoken about him before. He was head of the MK Ultra project in Canada. Just a little reference, so if you're looking for him, check that out.
Yeah, and that's when it begins. It begins 6 months after the memo was written about the Americans cooperating on mental phenomena. So suddenly they start MK Ultra. They start this mind thing, and people always have it as a mind control thing, which is part of it. But it was also the idea of consciousness, because in the 1950s, they were also running LSD experiments. Now, there are two drugs that we know that will open consciousness. And one is LSD, one is DMT, this famous ayahuasca drug.
Yes.
And this experiments were done in the 1990s with this, where people are interacting with alien beings when they have these ayahuasca experiences, these DMT experiences.
Absolutely.
And so that's what the CIA was doing. It wasn't so much the mind control thing, is they had a live alien. And they were in the 1950s, they were working on LSD and psychic driving and ESP. They were trying to figure out, how does this alien do this? How does the mind work? Because if you can control a person's mind, you can go to Russia, go and get Putin in the morning, pull him out of his office. He's not even knowing he's being pulled out. Talk in his head, give him ideas, tell him all sorts of stuff, and you can be back in Washington for lunch. This is tremendous technology, this ability to control, and the whole thing comes down to this idea of telepathy, which makes me very skeptical of a lot of the stories you'll hear about alien wars or all this sort of stuff. Once you have telepathy, basically all war has to end, because if you and I are going to go into battle, I know when you're going to pull the gun. You know when I'm going to pull the gun. You know where I'm going to shoot. I know where you're going to shoot. You know what my plans are. I know what your plans are. You can't do anything. It's all telepathic.
It's mad. Mutual agreed destruction.
Plus, you know, and I know who's going to win the war. Yeah. So if you know you're going to lose the war and you're going to die, would you start the war? So this idea of aliens having wars doesn't make any sense. Once you're telepathic, it basically eliminates war. You can't really, deception is impossible. Now you can do deception because you can hide, you can catch people by surprise. But once you can read people's minds, all this sort of ends. So,
and in an elevated state of consciousness, I think that the realization that we're all interconnected starts to become that much more present. The damage to one is damage to yourself.
Exactly.
Maybe not in the same way physically, but in a spiritual sense, or even just in regards to the way that the universe operates, like what you were saying with us destroying the planet. Yeah. There is, for lack of a better term, almost a karmic ramification for
absolutely.
that. It destabilizes existence. It destabilizes everything.
Yeah, and that's when you get into the ideas, when you start looking at the contactees. And what I'm most interested in is, what do the aliens tell you?
Like, yeah, I'm very fascinated about that.
And that's what they're telling them. They have basically simple messages. You're destroying the world. You're putting the world off a cliff, and they show these people these devastations of the world being destroyed and whatever stuff. And all these people end up becoming environmental crazy people running around with the environment and stuff like that. The same as they affected musicians, which I'm going to talk about on June 9th. Yes. They affected a lot of the major musicians. Elvis Presley, the Stones, John Lennon. And John Lennon, I believe, was abducted. I know his story. He
writes about in his music about how he's standing on his balcony in New York looking up and seeing UFOs.
Yeah, and then May Pang, who was with him, who I've talked to, I've had correspondence with her, tells the story. If you hear her tell the story, she talks about the fact that everything sort of stopped. That there was nobody in any of the apartments around her, and that's abduction. That's that when you hear those kind of stories where the aliens are able to sort of seal somebody off, and you take a look at the Moody Blues and the band Yes and Kiss and Cat Stevens. All these people who I'm going to talk about on June the 9th who were abducted. Clearly they're abducted. So the question is, why are aliens abducting musicians? And what I say is going on is that the aliens are lifting this consciousness, that musicians are the key people. If you want to change consciousness, if you're 25 years old, I could care less about you. Your religion is set. Your ideas about school are set. Your ideas about how the world works are set. You aren't going to change anything. What you want to do is, if you're going to abduct kids, you abduct them when they're in the cradle. That's when you want to influence people. And if you want to influence consciousness, you want the musicians, because the musicians are talking to kids who are between 9 and 20 years old. A kid will see his parents as the great, friend and look up to them. As soon as you're 9 years old, your parent's an idiot. And everybody knows that these kids have this sort of, they revolt. They don't want to listen to their parents. They want their own ideas. So if you're an alien and you want to influence these kids between 9 and 20 years old and make them change their consciousness, they're ready for a new idea. They're going to adopt this idea. And that's what you see. So you go back into the 60s and 70s, you see that all the major cultural and social revolutions were led by kids, by teenagers. They weren't led by the old buggers who control the thing. What happened was, when there was 250,000 people for gay rights or for against the war in Vietnam, it was at that point that the old guys who had set their ideas suddenly realized they're going to be out of power. Let's change the rules. But it's the young kids, it's those kids. So that's why it's so important that I believe that the aliens are influencing musicians. And it doesn't matter what musician it is. And I go through some of the stuff. I've written this stuff up, and people who have seen it are kind of amazed when you see how many of them directly were abducted or have had experiences. It's like basically, it's almost, at one point I thought, man, they got them all. It's unbelievable. And that's the whole thing is that, and these guys that people will say, well, they did the drugs, whatever. Yeah, they did the drugs, and that opened some of their consciousness. But they also were the guys that saved the world. If you take Sting, Sting, big in the 70s with Police. He did the ayahuasca experience. He started the Rainforest Foundation. Jerry Garcia talks about being abducted, this abduction experience after he does DMT. He starts the Rainforest Foundation. All these guys, and they save the rainforest. Olivia Newton-John, 15 years old, has this dramatic close encounter in the desert in Australia. She's one of the biggest people, environmentalists in the world. You see all of them, and you start looking at these big rock guys, and you'll see that they're out there for gay rights, they're out for saving the world, the poor people, all this sort of stuff, that they're leading this revolution. And so this is what it is. They're being influenced the same as the contactees are being influenced.
One of the things that scares me is that there is this, and I've been having a lot of conversations with people about this, there is this fear about this evolutionary leap that potentially we could take, this consciousness expansion that potentially, and I have to bring this up because I did receive some questions for you as well, but there are concerns just that people have about, I'm not one of them because I actually tend to agree with you very much in terms of I don't really allow the idea of like a fear-based power system, to influence my actions or my state of consciousness too much. You know, I'm certainly aware of it. I'm not going to ignore it and the possibility for it, but I don't necessarily completely fall into that camp. But one of the concerns is that as we are experiencing this evolution or this consciousness shift, that we're being shifted towards a one world system, and that this one world system potentially that we're being manipulated to think that it's a gathering of our consciousness for better things, but in fact it's actually to somehow lead us towards enslavement. And I know that I'm not really phrasing that as a question, but I mean, certainly I know that's one of the concerns that I've gotten in some of the emails that I've received, especially when I've done shows talking about extraterrestrials and aliens.
I guess the big question you got to look at is who's going to do the enslaving.
Yes.
Because that's basically one of the key 64 reasons that the government doesn't want this out. And that is because nationalism is sort of the last refuge of scoundrels. That you want to be an American, you don't want to be a world guy. And if you take a look at Ronald Reagan and now President Clinton, just in the last month, has talked about the same thing. He was on a TV show and he talked about the same thing. And Reagan used this expression in 1987 at the UN, and this was something I was at his archives, and I saw they actually pulled this out of speech, and Reagan said, I want it back in the speech. And this was the alien invasion remark that he had a photographic memory, and he used this thing. What would happen if we were faced with a threat from an alien force? How the world would unite. Now, people can say there's going to be a one world government, which is basically what it's going to come down to. It's going to be human, but the Americans aren't going to control it. You're basically going to have a situation where the world is going to control it, where the power shifts. So I think a lot of this is the government trying to say, this is going to be an evil thing. But when you look at the way they look at it, no, they want as much division as possible. You want, everybody fighting. When you come down to it, and Clinton said the same thing, there's going to be one world, that we're all humans, that we're one. And if you take a look at this message, one of the big messages coming across to the contactees is this oneness thing, that you are all one, that it's a hologram, that everything is in the one, and that if you destroy this other country, that's part of yourself, that you're part. And the key question that I say that should be asked is to understand how this all fits together, is it all comes down to experience. It comes down to how do you deal with your daily life as it is right now. And the question I say, and I still haven't got it convinced to abduction researchers to do this, and I'm hammering away at it, I say the one question that should be asked in every single abduction regression is, at any point in the past, did you agree to be in this situation? According to Mary Rodwell, it's done over 2,000 regressions in Australia. According to Dolores Cannon, who's done thousands in the United States, the answer is 100% yes. It's a total agreement. And what happens is, I have a good friend. There's a movie coming out by Warner Brothers. They're going to do a big movie. Julia Roberts is going to be in it. It's a big, huge movie. It's on Contactees. And my friend, who is the main contactee in the movie, who they're doing it on, when he was regressed, he was talking about a promise. He was being regressed by John Mack, an associate of John Mack's, Dr. Michael O'Connor. And he's talking about a promise. And O'Connor says, what are you talking about? You're talking promise. Ask the aliens, what are you promising? What's this promise all about? And he said, they have been with me since before I was born. This is all in agreement. If you take a look at the Moody Blues, who sold 300 million albums, they will say, they went to Colin Andrews, a friend of mine, the guy who invented the crop circles. They came to him after a lecture, and they told him, there was the lead guitarist and Mike Pinder, who was the head of the band, and they sat across from him at a dinner table, and they said, we remember before we were born. We remember we made an agreement. We were in a room, and we made an agreement to put stuff into lyrics. We agreed to do this. And that's what it comes down to. If you can take one regression back before a person was born, suddenly you're talking about multiple lives. Suddenly it is no longer a physical problem. It is no longer one world government. It is not what do you own, it is a spiritual problem. And it comes down to multiple lives. That the people who are in it may be in it because they agreed to be in it. That is part of an overall plan that takes thousands of lifetimes to bring this through. So it really doesn't matter whether you get free energy. It really doesn't matter, because if you get free energy, if tomorrow it is disclosed, nothing changes. You still got to go to school. You still got to go to work. Yep. You still got kids to put in school. Nothing is going to change. Life still comes down to how do you deal with your present experience. And if you take the UFO thing, and if it does stretch over multiple lives, that you agreed in a life to come in and be abducted and to be a part of this UFO thing, then basically, if it's multiple lives, it's experience. Everything's experience. There's no good. There's no bad. There's no time, there's no space, there's nothing. All there is experience, that you're just reincarnating, you're going through this cycle, and it's all a part of a game. As Shakespeare said, and I hated Shakespeare. When I went to university, I hated Shakespeare. Shakespeare said, and it's almost like he knew what was going on, all the world's a play, and all the men and women are but actors. They have their entrances and they have their exits, and every man plays many roles. That, if it comes down to it, if you want to look at the UFO phenomena, that's what it's all about. We're in a play. We've agreed to do this. We've agreed to put this whole thing. And the aliens are no different than a bunch of others. With the research I'm doing mostly now is this whole idea about what I call maybe a book calling inspiration. And I go through inspiration through music, through classical music. Because a lot of people say, oh, it's the musicians, the rock guys, it's all drugs, it's all the devil and stuff. So I said, well, let's go back and take a look at the church music. Yeah. It's same thing, all the classical. If you take a look at inventions, June the 9th, I'll mention 7 Nobel Prizes that came in downloads, inspirational downloads, or through dreams. I'll talk about Nobel Prize winners who are abducted. I will talk about scientific inventions of guys who made $100 million companies who told me clearly, I do not remember where the idea came from. All I remember is a guy standing at the end of the bed with a hood on. So you get these downloads where you have spiritual beings and you have aliens and you have all these sort of things that we're being influenced from some other realm to help us along, to raise consciousness. And it's not just simply free energy. Let's get an answer. Let's this physical world. We're stuck in this physical world view, and it's not. It's this multi-dimensional holographic universe where there's multiple lives. You've got to look at it instead of looking at it just like what can we get today? Because a lot of the times it comes down when ufology comes down to we're Westerners. We want more, and we want it yesterday. Give me free energy. I want cheap gas so I can drive big cars again, and I can start to waste stuff and stuff like that. And it comes down to what's in it for me instead of understanding a bigger picture of what's actually going on.
Yeah, and a lot of us have this fear that by somehow having to give up our wasteful tendencies, that somehow it's attached to our loss of freedom, which is, I think, complete garbage.
Yeah.
It's nonsensical. It doesn't make any sense. One of the things I did want to ask you about, though, too, you were mentioning contactees and that you spend a lot of significant time speaking with contactees. Is there a general feeling that they get when they've when they've had that encounter with the extraterrestrial, with the alien, is there a vibration, an energy, a sensation that they get that seems to be consistent, as you're mentioning, consistency throughout these experiences?
Okay, usually it starts very negative.
I was going to say, because I would be terrified.
They know. Well, what I say, and this is one of the big questions that's asked in ufology, is it good or bad? Yeah. Are the abductions good or are the aliens bad?
Yeah.
And I say you look at it the same thing as you look at experience.
Yeah.
Look at life. Instead of saying abduction, say life.
Yeah.
Some people think it's the greatest thing in the world. I mean, they're just fantastic. I'm glad to be here. Yeah. Some people are so frustrated and so fearful and hate life so much they take a gun, put it in their mouth, and blow their brains out.
Yeah.
So it's the same thing. It's like depends how you react to it.
Yeah.
So that's the way I look at it. Is it's sort of a thing where you have to look at thing. But people who are in the abduction thing usually start, and give an example again, Chris Bledsoe, who is this guy who's going to be in this movie that Warner Brothers is going to throw $18 million at this movie. This is I haven't got time to tell the story. It's the wildest story you've ever heard in your life. And he has this experience. He lives in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Southern Baptists, Pentecostals, no aliens. You don't talk about aliens here. He was a vicar in the Pentecostal church, was thrown out for dealing with devils. His wife left him, locked him up in an insane asylum, and he had this experience with 5 other witnesses, with his son, and dramatic. And he ended up in a situation where he had a business doing $18 million a year building houses. His business was all fell apart. He was cured of Crohn's disease. All these weird things. He locked himself up in a family room. He didn't come out. He wasn't allowed to talk to his kids about his experience. His wife said, "You do not talk to my kids about this. You do not." So he's basically shut himself in a family room for 9 months. His son, who encountered the actual aliens in a bush, locked himself in his bedroom for 6 months. Wouldn't come out. And if you had to come into his bedroom, you had to lock the door when you came in to talk to him. And so these traumatized, like horribly traumatized. And then suddenly he had an experience the same day I had my enlightenment experience about consciousness, realizing consciousness is what this is all about. The same day he has an experience, he is quiet, he comes public, then suddenly gets ridiculed in town, then he quietens down again from, say, 2008 to 2012, February of 2012, both he and I have this experience. And then he suddenly decides he has to go public. And what happens is he gets pulled by what he calls the shining lady, and he interprets her as like an angel thing. He gets interpreted, and the message he gets from this shining lady, the aliens take him to the shining lady, and the shining lady says, "Chris, you have a burden, and it is yours to carry." And I said, "Chris, do you know what the burden is?" He says, "Yes, I know what the burden is. The burden is the message. I am to tell the message. They have given me a message to give to the world." So then he suddenly decides he's going to go public, and he's going to tell this message. Now, you can't shut this guy up. He thinks he's saving the world. I mean, it's like, oh, my God. You know, the angels are talking to him. God's talking to him. He went from this situation of locking himself in a room for 9 months and not talking to his wife for literally 9 months and his kids to now running around having a big movie. So that's what basically comes down to is when people first have it, they're traumatized. And that's why we have this Experiencers Anonymous group that I run in Winnipeg, is for people who have had a UFO experience where they're traumatized. They don't know what to do. They can't talk. People, they've sort of brought out a little bit. People have traumatized, made fun of them. They shut up. They don't know what to do. They're basically suffering from depression, from, they're almost like somebody coming back from the Vietnam War or the Afghan War or something like that. And so what we do is we put them in a room where they're safe. They can talk. The only people in the room are people who've had the same type of experience, like AA. And once they start talking about it, once they start opening up, the fear goes away. They start to understand. They hear other people have the same experiences, and the fear leaves. And when you talk to people who have been through this for a number of years, they see it as a positive experience. So, but it does start as a negative experience because there's the fear, and the fears of the unknown. Once you understand what's going on, once we explain to you and let you talk to people who have had the same experience, who can tell you this is what happens, this is what's going to happen next, this is what it means, then they go, oh, okay. And then it becomes, a lot of the people suddenly become like missionaries. Yeah. They think that they are here to save the world. And that's what I tell them. As I said, I'm very interested. I'm not interested in sightings anymore. I'm very interested in contactees. And when I was in Phoenix, there was this big room, and they were complaining. One of the people was complaining about, oh, this is tough. I mean, we don't get treated right, and everybody's ignoring us. And I said, listen, I was one of the speakers at this big conference. I've spoken here twice. I've dealt with the President of the United States. I've chased intelligence agencies and governments and stuff like that. I do not do that anymore. All I do is deal with people like you in this room. And you people got to realize what the situation is. You may not know what happened to you. You know that you've had some sort of a UFO experience. The aliens are dealing with you for some reason. I said, you got to realize that if you understand the UFO story, it is the most important story in the world. Nothing is more important than this story. If you understand the significance of what it means, and you people got to realize that this, if UFOs were games, this would be the Super Bowl. And you people got to realize that you may not know what's going on with you. You may not understand what your thing is. You've been picked to play in the Super Bowl, and you better realize that you're playing an important role and try to figure out what it is. Because believe you me, as far as I'm concerned, I've been in ufology for 40 years. I've chased everybody. You're the most important people in the world. If there is an answer to the UFO, the subject, it is the people who are interacting with the aliens, who have been inside the ship, who are getting the messages, who are getting the downloads, who are actually getting downloads of technical material. We have two right now. There's papers that Dr. Edgar Mitchell, who is one of the men that walked on the moon, is one of the guys who edited this paper. There's two people who have gotten the unified field theory. One is a doctor in New York. One is just an ordinary person in Florida. These two people were downloaded 25, 30 pages of mathematical material. So when you take a look at this kind of stuff, you start realizing that this is critically important stuff if some of this stuff turns out to be true. This is what we should be looking at, is these people, because they're walking around with a lot of stuff in their heads.
Absolutely.
That may be the most important stuff that we have. We even had one, and I offered to put up the money to have these people regressed. One of them came, one told me earlier that she was on the ship and she was shown a formula on the ship. And she said, they showed her the formula and she said, no point in showing me that. I don't know nothing about mathematics. Total waste of time. No point in showing me that. And they said, when the time is right, you will know what this means. And she said, okay, fine, whatever. And then they said, we have the cure to cancer. And she said, well, what is it? And they said, it's something you use every day. Then about a year later, suddenly there's a guy comes out with a book out of Las Vegas, Nevada. He comes out with a book and he says, in the book, he says, I was on the ship and showed me a formula. And I said, no point in showing me the formula. I don't know anything about mathematics. And they said, when the time is right, you'll know what the formula is. It's a cure to cancer. And he said, well, let me write it down. They said, no, you can't write it down. You can just look at it. And he said, well, I'm going to write it down. They said, no, you can't look at it. So here's two people showing a formula, talked about the cure to cancer. I told both of them, I will pay for your regression. I'll fly you wherever it takes. I want to ask two questions. Number one, at any point in the past, did you agree to be in this situation? My key question that I want to ask. And the second one is, can you pull? And I asked the top regressionist in the world. I said, in a regression, can you pull that formula? If they were showing a complex mathematical formula, can you pull the formula? She says, yes. They will write the formula down. That's one of the best things, that stuff. Now these people are suddenly in the fear. It's like, oh, well, I don't know. Now they're hesitating. They really haven't agreed to the abduction or to the regression to pull this formula.
Absolutely.
So basically, the time isn't right. We live with cancer now for another 20 years. Maybe it didn't mean anything, but we spend $15 billion a year on cancer research. So I put up $1,000 to, so what? It doesn't go anywhere. $1,000. I mean, it looks like a pretty good chance to, try to find something here that we may have been given the cure to cancer, but we haven't run with it. So it's very, very important to understand some of the significance of some of the stuff that's going on. A lot of people don't realize how complex it is and how much evidence we actually have from various people all around the world that are giving this kind of material.
I've mentioned on the show before that I had an experience where I saw a UFO. I was at Patricia Beach and I was with a friend and we were walking down, and he every time we get together and whether or not we're having a smoke or having a drink, he tells everybody the story. If we're in a bar, he'll be like, you'll never believe this, because it was just amazing. And we're walking down the beach and he noticed it at first. He pointed to a light in the sky, and it was like a beacon. Yeah, we were wondering, it was like, is that a plane? And then just continually got brighter and brighter, and it got so big and bright, flashing, that he actually it got so it wasn't just like a tiny light in the distance, and it was flashing. It got so bright that it dominated the eyesight, my eyesight and his eyesight. And I remember the last time I saw it flash like that, it was so big that he actually freaked out, backed up, and swung his arms and hit me, and I fell to the ground. And I quickly grabbed him to try and pull him off of me so I could look back up at it. Because I was like, obviously, if it's coming for us, I was wondering, what is this?
Yeah.
I didn't see any actual structure to it. It was just this flashing light that continually got brighter and brighter. And it was, like I said, I've seen planes before. I've seen satellites before.
Yeah.
I've seen geese reflecting off the water. This was so significant. It's like putting a flash, like a camera flash, right in front of your face and going boom like that.
Yeah.
You tell me that, you know what I mean? Absolutely. I'm sure it was incredible. And even now, speaking of it, it stirs the emotions because it was one of those things where we were both there. And I was so glad that he was there because, like, immediately it's odd how my consciousness wanted to dismiss it.
Yeah.
Wanted to try and find as many things as possible in order to convince me that that didn't happen, because the ramifications of the possible truth might be too much for me to bear.
Yeah.
The reality that I saw something that I can't explain, because it's so much more comfortable to be able to explain everything, to be able to assign everything to its particular place. And now I have this in front of me. Everything changes. It's a game changer.
It is a game changer. And one of the key things when I lecture about this, I mentioned the fact, why do UFOs have lights?
Mm-hmm.
So you can see them.
Yeah.
When they abduct people, nobody sees them.
Mm-hmm.
So when they don't want to be seen, they can be cloaked.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, when you see a UFO, my impression, the more I see it, the more I say is, when you see a UFO, it was meant for you to see a UFO.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like it triggers you. A lot of people who are in the UFO business, a lot of them will say, they get frustrated and say, that's it, I've had it, I quit, I can't take this anymore, there's no answers, whatever. And we always have an expression, even back in the 80s, we'd have an expression say, don't worry, he'll be back.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. When you get triggered, that they're triggering people, and you get into this, and it's like the rabbit hole. You can't get out. It's like you get obsessed with it. Just you got to do it. Almost like they're controlling people. They've triggered you. They've triggered me. And especially with my initial sighting, which for 40 years I didn't think about this. But remember, I told you when it first happened, my friend wouldn't go out. This was February. Mm-hmm. But when they got the CKY film, then suddenly I said, "Oh, let's go." Now, UFOs are never seen on the ground. You cannot capture a UFO on the ground. Mm-hmm. They don't allow you to come and capture them on the ground and this sort of thing. It was almost like when I look back now, I say, maybe they allowed themselves to be captured on the ground, allowed themselves to be filmed because I hadn't gone out. They wanted me, because I went out days after that film took place. Mm-hmm. I wanted to go, and I'd forgotten about it, didn't think about it. The CKY film happened. They allowed themselves to be caught on the ground. So then I start looking and saying, maybe really nothing is random. Maybe everything is the way it is. And that's, if you look at a reincarnation type world, that's the way it is. If you take a look at Michael Newton and Life Between Lives and stuff like that, where he does 7,000 regressions, before you're born, you agree that you and I are going to meet. We're going to do an interview. You're going to meet this guy. You're going to do this. You're going to do this. And everything is an agreement. Everything is, so that's when synchronicity comes in. You think it's, well, it's, just happened. You planned it. You planned it yourself. And then when you die, it basically comes down to you come in front of the life review or the judgment or whatever, and basically they say, how did it turn out? You ran this little play, you put all your people together to learn all these different lessons. How do you think you made out? And that's basically the way I look at the world. And when you start looking at the UFOs in that terms, then it all starts to make some sense as to what are they doing, exactly what's happening, and how this all these pieces fit together.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are unfortunately out of time, I believe. I have a list of other questions.
Well, some other time we can maybe
absolutely.
do.
I would love to do that. I want to thank you very much for coming onto the show, because this is an area of great interest for me, and I've mentioned before on the show my particular experience with this type of phenomenon. And I think that you provided a very one thing I really enjoyed is your interpretation of it. Your personal experiences have provided a very open concept, and one of the things that I think is really refreshing about it as well is the ultimate positivity that you carry with it, especially because there seems to be so much fear attached to the idea of it. And I do very much agree with what you're talking about in regards to a necessary consciousness shift. The repetition of fear and the paralyzation of it gets us nowhere. And ultimately the only way that we're going to evolve is by looking at this stuff a little bit more critically, actually, and end with that open heart and realizing that maybe not everything is as scary as we think, even though it may initially seem like that. And once again, I really hope that everybody, I'm going to be there. I'm fascinated to listen to the influence in regards to music, because I've heard a lot of stuff from various camps in regards to the theories, a lot of it about Satanism and things like that, which is always interesting. But I think that there's, I completely agree. I think above that sort of level stuff, there's a consciousness aspect to it. It's whether or not you're pursuing the Christian or the Satanic or the Buddhist or whatever, it's all about consciousness. Yeah. And those are just the tools. And so I just want to mention again, Winnipeg Modern Knowledge 2014 tour. That's June 9th, Marlborough Hotel, 331 Smith Street. It's at the Skyline Ballroom. That's Monday, June 9th, 2014. It's starting at 5:30 p.m., but if you're going to register, you want to be there for 4 p.m. to 5:30. You can buy your tickets online. Just go on to modernknowledge2014.com/Winnipeg, or just Modern Knowledge. Google that, 2014. Look for your city if you're listening to this outside of Winnipeg, and get on there. And be sure to come down and not only to learn, but to support these people in their work, because their work is beneficial to not just those that are interested in the realm of UFOlogy, but also to, I would say, to our planet Earth. I mean, sharing these experiences are going to help people's consciousness evolve. And like you said, this very well could be meant to inspire people. So thank you very much, Grant, for coming onto the show.
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Hopefully we can talk again.
Absolutely. I'd love it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're on the Red Waters.